Before I get going today, I have a big acknowledgement to make of the source of what I have to say. So I'm leaning pretty heavily on this book. Make sure this is good. It's Justice on Earth, People of Faith Working at the Intersections of Race, Class, and the Environment. And I kind of wanted to give a shout out. It's an anthology of a variety of essays. And I wanted to give a shout out to the two co-authors because they actually are from now living up in our part of the world. One of them is the Reverend Jennifer Nordstrom, and she's the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. And the other one is the Reverend Manish Mishra Marzetti, and he's the new senior minister at the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor, Michigan. So there's that. And then I wanted to say there were two essays in particular that I really leaned into. One is called The Ethical Implications of Environmental Justice by the Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Sophia Betancourt, who also was the first woman president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And then The Formation of the Environmental Justice Movement by Paula Cole Jones. She's an author, an activist, and a staff member with the UUA. So, this came in my email this week from the Unitarian Universalist Association. I am Karen Brommer, the UUA's Climate Justice Senior Associate with the Organizing Strategy Team. I join my colleagues at Love Resists, Side with Love, and Congregational Advocacy and Witness. My work allows me to engage in the deepest vision of what we as UUs hope to become. In addition to working on connecting UUs with frontline partners, I also manage the Green Sanctuary program, which I know this congregation is heavily involved in. I will host this newsletter, which will highlight voices and priorities of multiple UU environment and climate-related organizations. And then this part was in bold in a separate text box. The UUA has made climate justice and one of four intersectional priorities. The others are LGBTQ and gender justice, combating criminalization, and voting rights and expanding democracy. My focus is on supporting frontline leadership for climate justice, and I hope to help leverage the many kinds of Unitarian Universalist efforts for positive impact on the climate crisis. There are many, many ways to do this work, which I hope we will do more effectively and energetically in collaboration. And then the email went on to talk about all the efforts that are going on right now. And she signs it, Yours in Faith and Solidarity, Karen. So I read that and I thought, well, that's really cool that we're really getting behind this. And I thought, well, what are we getting behind? Because if you asked me what the definition of climate justice was, I could probably guess and be pretty close, but I'm not sure that I could tell you exactly what climate justice was. And then, frankly, I didn't really understand how it differed from environmental justice or, frankly, from environmentalism. And I was married into an incredibly environmentalist family, so I'm pretty in tune with what's going on, but I'm not sure that I knew the differences. And then why would that be so important to Unitarian Universalism that it's one of our four main focuses? I mean, that might be kind of obvious, but I thought, well, somebody should tell me that, right? So this month, since we're talking about journey, and I chose today's topic as the climate justice journey because I wanted to do it from a Unitarian Universalist point of view. And I chose today to kick this off because the 22nd of March to the 22nd of April, which is Earth Day, is chosen as climate or environmental month, climate justice month. So I thought it would be appropriate to do this today. So for this climate justice journey, to organize my thoughts, it kind of worked out to do it chronologically from historic points of view, as if we're sort of on some spaceship or time machine and we can just stop at certain points in our history and kind of say, okay, this is the moment at which we thought this and this is how it has evolved. And it frankly starts with Unitarianism, not the Universalism part of it at this point, and Transcendentalism's influence on Unitarianism. So what we just read a few minutes ago was the credo of Transcendentalism in the early 1800s in New England. And at that time, transcendentalism was a major shift in the journey of Unitarianism in America. So Henry David Thoreau, which Walden Pond fame, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who those words, the oversoul, was attributed to, Theodore Parker, and others, are the descendants of Unitarian upper crust society in Boston at the time. And they were rebelling about how stuffy Unitarian church had become and joined a counter movement called Transcendentalism. Now, Transcendentalism wasn't just about Unitarians and religion. It was a cultural movement that put basically America on the map at the time. It was felt that Americans no longer had to rely on Europe for our cultural moorings, that we'd created a cultural movement that was uniquely American. However, the religious overtones of Transcendentalism sprung up in the nascent Unitarian movement and its dynamic journey at the time. Unitarianism was growing very quickly. So what is Emerson describing in this oversoul? You've heard me talk about this before, but I never really called it that or named it that until I looked at the reading this morning. It's a theology that religious experience at its core is sourced from the nexus of these three things: God, nature, and humans. And that it's really about, if you get those together, you've pretty much created heaven on earth sort of thing. It kind of also implies that organized religion isn't necessary, and all we need to do is something like Thoreau did with his time on Walden Pond, spend about a year kind of by yourself in this little cabin, getting in touch with nature, immersing oneself in the pristine and pure power of nature. And there one will find one's ultimate meaning and orientation to the universe, which is the classic quests, usually, for any religious person. And there's a quote in there that we all read, or one, between the two of us we read. It's, "Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it is memorable." So the one thing you need to take away from that, it's very individualistic. It's talking about how I feel nature inside my mind and how it is a memorable moment. So that's the beginning of what we were talking about for Transcendentalism, and the beginning of sort of a feeling of nature being important to Americans. So if we're in our time machine, my next stop, you're going to put your seatbelts on for this one, because we're jumping way ahead to the mid-20th century, which is really the beginning of the founding of environmentalism. And a lot of you know this. We have Wisconsin's own Aldo Leopold in 1949 doing the Sand County Almanac and his theology of a land ethic, which comes down to this, quote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." So really putting that out there as a right and wrong that includes the environment. Leopold launched the modern environmental movement because he created a good argument for humanity coexisting with nature, rather than always seeking dominion over it, as was the dominant cultural belief in America since the Europeans first arrived. Well, coupled with that, the founding of the environmentalist movement was 2 decades later. A man named Lynn White, who's an American historian and credited as being one of the fathers of environmentalism, wrote an article in the Journal of Science, March 1st, 1967, called "The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis." And here he identifies, and this is a quote, "the victory of Christianity over paganism as the greatest psychic revolution in our history of our culture." Let me say that again. "The victory of Christianity over paganism as the greatest psychic revolution in the history of our culture." Okay, folks, that happened in like 300, 400 AD. It was Constantine and the people that followed until they finally conquered all of pagan Europe. So what he's saying is that it said it justified an unsustainable dominion as the cultural center of humanity's relationship to the earth. So rather than a religion that was very earth-based and paid a lot of attention to the earth and the cycles of what went on, it turned to a Christianity that was very much hierarchical, and you brought it, think about the major cathedrals of Europe, you brought it indoors, everything was focused up to heaven, and a God, and the hierarchical structure of the church, so it suddenly took us away from nature and separated us from nature. And so he pointed out that that was the moment that European culture shifted, and the Europeans that came to America brought that with them, and then Aldo Leopold saying, well, wait a minute, that's not right. We need to have something that coexists with nature. Now, in the mid-20th century, there's a couple of key points that you probably all know. In 1962, Silent Spring, the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson. Sorry? Carson. It says that. Thank you. I just need to read. There's attention to the poisoning of our environment by DDT. And so particularly in that, and I remember this as a kid, people talking about it because all the bluebirds were suddenly going away. And I never saw a bald eagle as a kid. Now I live over in Appleton on the Fox River, and there's hundreds of bald eagles. And it's just astounding to me that that came back. But I just have to think back when I was a kid. My kids will never know that, a time when we weren't even sure that our national bird was going to survive. So there was Silent Spring, there was Wisconsin's own governor, and then Senator Gaylord Nelson's Earth Day in 1970 is almost always cited as the day that the environmental movement started, and it was all about saving the earth from the pollution that had gone on unravished. And it kind of culminated in December 7th, 1972 with the Apollo 17 space mission, where they were far enough out in space to look at the Earth backwards, from outer space, look back at it, I should say. And it's kind of been talked about as the big blue marble. And if you think of that image, I probably should have had it today, but if you think of that image, it was this spectacularly pristine, quiet-looking image that didn't have anything to do with really inhabitants of the planet at all. So that's where we were with the founding of environmentalism in the mid-20th century. So our third stop on our climate justice journey is the late 20th century, where it turned into environmental justice. So this, I think many people in the room lived through this, it's a series of environmental battles highlighting the impact of environmental dangers to humans. This is when the human side of it and justice came into it. The most famous, and I remember this as a kid, was the 1978 Love Canal. So for those of you that aren't familiar, it was a working class neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, or Niagara Falls, New York, that was built on a toxic waste site that was actually oozing toxic waste. And so there was a high rate of cancer and birth defects. And they had to really go to court and get the country's attention to be able to have the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, be created and then have a super fund to move the 800 families away from it, that it wasn't okay to just have them live there. There's a couple others. One was in Houston in 1979, and this is interesting because it was a middle class this time, not working class, but middle class African American community sued to prevent a waste facility from being built in their neighborhood. And they did it on the basis of racism, because they pointed out that 8 of the 10 waste facilities in that vast metropolitan area that's both population-wise and geographically quite vast, that 8 out of the 10 waste facilities were all built in African American neighborhoods. So it kind of smacked of racism in any way you looked at it. They did lose the case, but from that came an important quote, or a shift in mindset, and this is a quote that I lifted. They said that there was a form of apartheid, that it was a form of apartheid, where whites were making decisions and black people, brown people, and people of color, including Native Americans on reservations, had no seat at the table. And that basically galvanized the environmental justice movement. And the father of environmental justice is Robert Bullard, who in 1983, about 4 years later, in Sociological Inquiry wrote an article, Solid Waste Sites and the Black Houston Community. And he's currently actually a distinguished professor at Texas Southern University. He said that the environmental movement likes to believe that it's colorblind because you're basically saving the earth. We all live on the earth, so it doesn't matter what color you are. We should all be for this. But he said it's anything but the truth. And this was the quote. African Americans making 50 to 60,000 a year, and this was back in 1983, are much more likely to live in a polluted environment than poor white families making just 10,000 per year. He said the environmental movement launched in 1970 lacked the consciousness and commitment to address structured racial and economic inequality. And then there were other cases, like one in North Carolina, where they sprayed PCB-laden oil on the roads for years, had to dig it all up because it was cancer-causing, and then they needed to take 10,000 trucks of this and dump it somewhere, and they put it in a landfill, and another lawsuit that people lost. But it was the same idea, that there's these specific populations and these specific sites that were feeling the brunt of the pollution and the degradation of the environment. So the last stop on our journey is the present, early 21st century, where environmental justice becomes climate justice. So just to make sure I was well grounded, I went to Wikipedia. And it says, climate justice is a term used for framing global warming as an ethical and political issue rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. And its fundamental principle is that those who are least responsible for climate change suffer its greatest consequences. So you've essentially taken the environmental justice movement, or its very specific locations, physical locations, and said the degradation of the earth is on a massive global scale because of global warming, and so now this is it's irrespective of location, and acknowledging that there are lots of wealthier people on this planet who, when their basement floods, can just do something about it or pick up and move a whole city, but there's populations throughout the globe in every corner who have historically been marginalized, who don't have any way to deal with what's about to come and has already started. So that's where climate justice is. And I want to go back to our Unitarian roots when we started this conversation. And Sophia Benecourt helps me do that. She claims and argues that there's a conflict between the view of our first and seventh principles and it's artificial. So it was wonderful that the Time for All Ages today focused on our principles, and they're sitting right in front of you, although it's kind of small cursive. I'm not sure if you could read it from there. But our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, and the seventh principle, the interconnected web of all existence. She said that we inherently, Unitarian Universalists, sort of have this conflict between the two, and it's artificial. And she uses a book by Paul Autka that came out in 2008 called Race and the Nature of Transcendentalism to the Harlem Renaissance. Now this, Paul Autka is a professor, associate professor of English at Kansas University. He contrasts this, and this is very good for me. I loved reading this. He contrasts the image of man alone communing in pristine wilderness of the Transcendentalists, which were devoid even of the native peoples who were there before the European imperialists arrived. So, Walden Pond, it's all about birds and trees and flowers and clouds. There's no humans whatsoever. And that's how that kind of interconnected web. Now, I'll acknowledge they didn't have the seven principles back then, but the concepts come from that time. So he contrasts that image of the Transcendentalists with the traumatic, and this is a quote, with the traumatic African-American experience of non-human nature, including the historic conscription, control, and definition of black bodies as bestial livestock. So the Transcendentalists would have believed in our seventh principle as a matter of the source of spirituality and theology, but they were also often fierce abolitionists, fighting intensely for the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, and especially the how horrible slavery was and wanted to get rid of slavery, but they generally did not mix those two ideas together. They needed that nature idea to be completely free of any human touch, and then they were really fighting for the inherent worth and dignity. So what Benecourt is saying, that environmentalism, global warming, and justice for historically marginalized people are completely integrated and must be addressed as such. Which leads me then to the Paula Cole-Jones article. And I'm pretty much going to quote her and what she has to say. She starts off with this: as Unitarian Universalists continue to work on environmentalism and climate change, we must operate with the knowledge of structured racial and economic inequality so that we are truly confronting oppression and doing our part in building the beloved community. So then she presents these questions for us to talk about. And I would love to talk about them at 11:20 to 12 when we have the congregational response, or in future gatherings when we get together, because I think they're important in Fond du Lac, and especially since this is a Green Sanctuary congregation that's choosing to renew our Green Sanctuary status and has come up against this effort to have us reach out to marginalized populations. And I know we've kind of stumbled on what should we do about that. I think this gets to the heart of the question. So here we are. Discover the answers to key questions. Are environmental decisions in your community fair and equitable? Are they tied to voters' rights issues in your community? Which communities are at risk? Who's at the table? What organizations have been formed by and for people of color and working class communities to address environmental racism and classism? What cases have been fought in your community? Which ones have been won and which ones still need attention? How can you partner with people of color in your community? What are the connections between environmental justice and climate justice? Who can you invite to speak with your organization? What can you do to build relationships, build trust, build partnerships, and make a difference? So I think they're pretty intriguing questions, and I don't have the answers. So I'm really looking to those of you that live in Fond du Lac and have been here for a while to help fill in the blanks, because I know you're pretty connected to the community. So I'd like to finish today by going back to Emerson's vision of the oversoul, and then read it again from a 21st century climate justice perspective, from a perspective of intersectionality, from a perspective that God and all of the environment, including all the humans in the environment, are one universal, interrelated, eternal soul. Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. Blessed be. And amen.